The last change of governance for the MBTA was 5 years ago after a collapse in service triggered by a series of snowstorms. The Fiscal and Management Control Board put in place under Governor Baker is due to expire later this year as the state and the rest of the country emerge from a public health crisis. For transportation advocates, that coincides with an opportunity to readjust governance for the T with an eye toward challenges in the future. To tell us what that could mean is a senior attorney with the Conservation Law Foundation, Staci Rubin. Thank you very much for being with us, Staci.
Thank you for the opportunity, Chris. Happy to be here.
Staci, 5 years ago, the snowstorms hit us, and we saw how many years of neglect had set the T up for that kind of collapse. We're at a different point right now. Things in some ways are better, but they're also maybe in some ways worse going down the line. So what should the focus for governance be right now?
We actually released a report yesterday along with our partners at Transportation for Massachusetts, the MBTA Advisory Board, and MassPIRG, recommending that the successor board for the MBTA shift its focus from a rescue mission to one that is focused on achieving a 21st century transportation system. And that system must be safe, reliable, frequent, resilient, and accessible. We really need to operate a system with a customer focus, and we have to make sure that that system is contributing to greenhouse gas emission reduction goals and ensuring that people can ride that system safely and effectively.
Well, when I think of the future, I start with the present. I see two scary images. One is the phantom trolley or bus that goes by with almost nobody on it, and another is the crowded bus with too many people too soon down the path to reopening. So how do you balance those two things?
So we have been actively engaging with the MBTA staff and in close communication with leadership to say when we are seeing a crowded bus, for example, or a subway car, that we are saying, here's the time that we saw it, there needs to be increased frequency. We've also provided data that the Conservation Law Foundation compiled to say that there are certain communities and neighborhoods where it's less likely that people can work remotely. So we already know the neighborhoods and the routes which need to increase the frequency in order to ensure that people are getting to the essential trips and places they need to go. So for example, some of the really crowded locations we've seen lately are on several buses and on the Blue Line. So the Route 111, which travels between Chelsea and Haymarket in downtown Boston, we've seen some significant crowding on that route and have notified the T to say you've got to increase the frequency. We're really shifting toward this reopening plan. We want the MBTA to use the data that's available to know which routes are going to have a high percent of riders that are dependent on transportation, the ones that don't have access to jobs where they can work remotely.
That's interesting because you're talking about Chelsea and East Boston. These are areas with high rates of infection from COVID-19. We have some other parts of Boston where that's an issue, and they seem to overlap with people who rely on the T for getting to work. I guess the T has to look more carefully at the distinction between people who have to go someplace else to work and people who can do that work from home.
Exactly. And it's not surprising to us at all that the recent data show that locations with the greatest COVID-19 infection rates are communities with the higher percentages of people of color. And we've seen just decades and generations of racial and class inequities that are multiplied by the spread of COVID-19. And we're also seeing that those places tend to be places where there have been long-term exposure to air pollution. So those are the locations that it's most critical to get people onto public transit, get them to the essential jobs that they are providing, and make sure that they can get to a grocery store effectively and efficiently. Ideally, we also need to make sure that we are creating electric buses and electric systems so that we are improving air quality in these neighborhoods as well.
If you go back about 20 years ago, there was a very common notion that the T was supposed to be financially self-sufficient. We are now getting into a point of time for at least another year probably where we're going to have to essentially subsidize a lot of unused space on the T that doesn't bring in revenue. How is that going to be handled? How should that be handled with the structure of the governance board?
So we are recommending that the future governance board be a completely independent board. That is one that is not reporting to the MassDOT board of directors. Currently, the Fiscal and Management Control Board does not have the authority to issue its own debt and has to make recommendations, and the decision for the financial issues really remain in a lot of ways with the MassDOT board of directors. Now is the most critical time for there to be an independent board that is able to make hard decisions, able to decide when to issue debt, and recommend to the legislature any additional revenue options that are necessary. So we want to make sure that the future board of directors is specifically focused on the MBTA and is focused on how to spend the federal stimulus dollars that we expect to come to the MBTA. So in particular, we want to make sure that the future governance board is able to amend any borrowing authorization, refinance the MBTA's debt, and to be really transparent with the public about what it's doing and why and how that's in riders' interests.
Well, you have the Fiscal and Management Control Board, or its successor, you have the Department of Transportation Board. These are all largely appointed by the governor. So what's the real difference in getting some kind of independence for the people in charge of the T?
We're recommending independence and that the people who are appointed to those roles be reflective of the riding and working community. So in particular, the current Fiscal and Management Control Board has 5 members. We're recommending that that be increased to 7 members. And we want to make sure that the majority of those board members actually ride the system. It's critical for people governing the board to understand on a firsthand basis what it's like to ride the system. We're also recommending that there be certain entities who are recommending the future board members. So those include municipalities who are contributing the assessments and better able to oversee what happens with the MBTA. We want to make sure that there are community-based organizations that can make recommendations for who is in the future board member seat. And we want to make sure that there is continued public transparency with the next board. One of the ways that the Fiscal and Management Control Board has been enormously successful is that they have taken the time at every single meeting to allow for public comment. That needs to continue, and we need to make sure that the future board members are responding to the concerns that they're hearing through the public comment period.
What about expertise in either transportation or, for that matter, public health? How do you get that onto this board?
So we are recommending that there be a number of board members who have a variety of qualifications. So in particular, we're looking for people who have at least 3 years in some sort of a leadership or managerial role. We want to make sure that there's expertise in labor and employment matters. Certainly somebody with experience riding public transit and working with environmental justice communities. And also somebody who has experience with public transit operations. We're recommending a variety of these qualifications we think will result in a balanced set of perspectives. And we're further recommending that every board member be eligible for a $15,000 annual stipend. We think that will facilitate participation of future board members who would not necessarily be able to serve for free, which is what most of the current members are doing.
Right now, in addition to working out a new plan for governance that would take effect after June 30th, there's a real fiscal challenge here, isn't there? I mean, if you look at what's happening to state revenue across the board, even city taxes in cities and towns, isn't this going to be a real difficult situation?
Absolutely. We are experiencing a number of crises that have not ever happened all at the same time. So it is critical for a future governance board who understands what money is coming from the federal government, how that money is likely to be completely sufficient to cover the lost fare revenue, as well as the reduced sales tax, which is primarily a source of funding for the MBTA. We are working with our elected officials, both at the federal level and state level, to figure out ways to identify sources of funding that can help fill the gaps and not only just maintain the existing operations, but get us to a new normal that is healthy. So for example, as I was saying before, there have been inequitable impacts for low-income communities, communities of color. We need a public transportation system that really works better for those people and improves air quality. So we need to be moving toward electrification, and our current Fiscal and Management Control Board have identified priority lines for electrification and required that there be a bus transformation program. So we definitely need funds to make that happen. We're hopeful that the next board will be able to decide what additional revenue is needed and the sources of that revenue that will be just and fair, whether that comes from increased corporate taxes or other means. But there are lots of creative ideas out there, and we need the next board to help contribute to the solutions.
We could emerge from this pandemic even fairly soon with less traffic congestion because more people are working from home. But what's the lesson to take going down the line about air quality and why that matters? What would you like to see as far as transportation policy around that?
So it is critical that we do not return to the old normal. While we anticipate that there will be reduced traffic congestion, we do think that there's going to be more people who were previously riding public transit that will shift to driving in cars, just out of fear of riding public transportation or perhaps being on a crowded vehicle. So we would like to see more frequent service, particularly on routes that we expect to be busy, those routes that are serving the transit-dependent populations. And I'll just throw out a couple. So bus routes 28, 23, the 111, the 116 and 117, the SL5. We need to see increased service on the Blue Line and really making sure that we're not focused on just peak times anymore. We're expecting that there's going to be kind of a flattening of travel, that it's going to be an increased number of riders at off-peak hours, just in order to spread out the number of people traveling. And it's crucial that we get people on public transit and really try to get them out of their cars. So we recommend that there continue to be fare-free trips and to allow all-door boarding on trolleys and buses. We think that'll facilitate just a more rapid way of getting on and off the vehicles. We'd really like to see that there be masks provided for riders who aren't able to get those, and enforcement to make sure that everybody who are riding the systems are wearing their masks. One note of caution is we need to make sure that there is not disproportionate enforcement against people of color for not wearing masks or for maybe not wearing them the right way. And we need to ensure that there's frequent cleaning on buses and trains, which includes adequate personal protective equipment, as well as adequate compensation and support for our workers. We want to make sure that we are implementing new practices that really work for both riders and workers. And finally, we need fare structures that really work. Once we sort of transition to that longer term new normal, well into phase 4 of the reopening plan, we'd like to make sure that there is a permanent low-income fare available on all modes of transportation, even beyond the MBTA. And we need to make sure that there is a plan for electrification and expanded bus route service.